Singh to introduce the speaker before we get going with the talk itself.
Thank you, Vinu. Today we have a talk which is going to be quite different from almost all the other talks that we have had. The speaker is Mr. Manikandan Venketaramanan. His name is a bit of a tongue twister, so I think I'll call him Mani. Is that okay?
That's fine, sir.
Now, Mani is a finance and risk management professional who has obtained his Chartered Financial Analyst and Financial Risk Manager Charter. He did his MS in Finance from the University of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, incidentally, was once a railroad town that was the hub of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Having worked as a liquidity and interest rate risk manager with a British bank, he currently serves as a senior consultant with one of the big four American consulting firms. He also has an accounting training, having completed the majority of the levels in the Chartered Accountancy qualification. Above anything else, he's an avid railfan. As an avid railfan, he is interested in reading about the past and the present of railroading, its operations and technology. He serves as the director of the UK-based WATTRAIN. WATTRAIN standing for World Alliance of Tourist Trains and Trams and Trains. Very proudly represents India and provides information and ideas to the fellow directors across the globe. He is also a member of the UK-based Advanced Steam Traction Trust, which has as its objective the promotion of the principles of L D Porta for continued steam locomotive operation. L D Porta, incidentally, was an Argentinian who made a lot of improvements in the steam locomotive in the days when steam locomotion was dying out. Mani also connects and liaises with various railroad associations in the USA. He is an active and passionate member of the RAS and looks forward to continuing in this organization. In the last international conference that we had in March, apart from the core group of the Rail Enthusiast Society, Mani was one of the most active members behind the scenes. He was instrumental in getting us 2 speakers at the conference. With this brief introduction, it's over to you, Mani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for the introduction. And I would like to thank RES very much for giving me this opportunity to present and to give a talk. It's indeed an honor and a privilege for me. So with that being said, we have history is actually a story. So we have a story which occurred between the latter part of the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century in the United States, which is roughly straddles the Gilded Age, as they are called, where there was unbridled capitalism and then the progressive era. So we will cover, as you can see here, there are a couple of themes, which is the topic of this particular talk. So you have the basics surrounding that particular era, the cast of characters who played a key role, the companies which were involved in this corner, what was the target, and how the raid, which is that corner, was implemented. And of course, along the way, we will also learn a little bit about the surprisingly modern theory of railroad operations, which these entrepreneurs, the industrialists followed. I won't call them as robber barons because they did add value. So what are the theory of railroad operations? And then finally, a surprising twist to the tale. 120 years after this event happened, there was something similar which happened in January of 2021. So we're going to have a very short look at that as well. So without any further ado, so let's start this particular talk. All right, basics. So what is a corner? So there is a very interesting quote by one Thomas Lawson, who was an American financial banker and also a stock speculator. Corner spells ruin backward and forward. I know it's not an auspicious way to start, but you'll get there. No one can tell until a corner is over who's beneath the ruins. Often those buried deepest have had no part in the making of it. So what's a corner? So corner involves 3 aspects in stocks. One is control, the other is manipulation, and the third one is takeover. We'll cover one by one. Control. So in investing or in trading, a corner is when one individual or an institution tries to obtain a controlling interest in, it can be a stock, it can be a commodity like gold, or it can be any other security. This is usually very hostile and is used to further another hostile objective, such as taking over control of a particular security, to take over control of a company, for instance. Moving on. Corner usually involves a great deal of manipulation. One of the most notorious examples of a corner was that of the gold market corner of 1869, which was orchestrated by this gentleman here, Mr. Jay Gould, and a couple of others. He tried to corner the gold market because the US had just come out of the Civil War. It had a lot of debt in terms of borrowing from multiple countries, and then they tried to use the gold, because in those days the currencies were pegged to gold. So they tried to profit by cornering the gold market. Interestingly, I'm sorry, I just lost the PPT here. Just give me 1 minute. Yeah, I hope you can still see the PPT.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, so he tried to corner the gold market, and then what happened was he was crushed by no less than the US president himself, which was Ulysses S. Grant, who released gold into the market and crushed the corner and humbled him. So why this gentleman is being covered here is that, since we are going to talk about the Union Pacific Railroad, but he was one of the gentlemen who ran the Union Pacific Railroad and tried to make it very, very efficient. So he had his own dubious set of machinations in the stock market, but he also did something good for the railroad industry in the United States. Moving on. Takeover. That's the third element. So usually 9 times out of 10, corners are done to take over a company or an industry. I just gave an example of a chalkboard which was used by President Grover Cleveland, of course, before he became president, about what actually happened in the gold corner. So you can see that in September of 1869, the gold price increased from 150 to 162, and so on and so forth within a span of a day. And then when the gold was released into the open market by the president, the gold prices crashed. So just an interesting bit of evidence related to the gold corner. All right, so that's it about corners. We will move on to the current talk, the theme of this talk, which is the corner of the stock of the Northern Pacific Railway Company. As always, there are the protagonists and there are the antagonists. So you can see that on the left-hand side, you have 3 protagonists who are sort of the good guys here. We can call them the Pandavas, because the Pandavas are always lower in number compared to the Kauravas. And then the antagonists are on the right-hand side. You have 4 of them. And of course, these are the major players. And we'll see one by one who these players are. Number 1, this gentleman is the theme of today's talk, because he was the one who was instrumental in initiating this particular corner. This guy, he was not a child of privilege. He was born poor. He started his career as a stockbroker, and he was called Edward Henry Harriman. So after being a stockbroker, he took over control of the Illinois Central Railway, made it very, very efficient and profitable. And Illinois Central, we're going to see in some time, it's very unique in being one of the few north-south transcontinental railroad. Everything else runs east to west. The Illinois Central, along with there is another road which is called the Kansas City side, which we'll talk about later if we have the time. So this is a north-south transcontinental which straddles the border of Canada to Texas. So this guy initially took over that particular railroad, made it efficient, reduced the cost of funding, and then he wanted to build his own railroad empire. So what happened was, at this point in time, you had the Union Pacific Railroad Company, which was federally chartered, but it was very inefficiently run. And then it became bankrupt. There were a group of financiers trying to restructure the Union Pacific Railroad. He took over the reins of the Union Pacific Railroad, and we will also cover in a short while how he made it very, very efficient. He used the debts of the Illinois Central Railroad, which was well run and it had a low cost of capital, to fund expansions in Union Pacific. So literally, rather than going to the market at an expensive rate, he used the existing debt of Illinois Central, which was cheaper. So he raised debt for the Illinois Central and he used it for the Union Pacific, which was one of the many financial engineering techniques he used to get funds at a lower cost and invest millions and millions of dollars to make the railroad very, very efficient. And he was the master of transacting business on the telephone. And then he was also adept at delegation. And he also, along with his sons, he started one of the merchant banking enterprises, which still currently exists. It's called Brown Brothers Harriman. So he had his own industrial arm, just like how the Tatas had to fund his own industrial empire. He had his own finance arm, to fund his industrial empire. So we'll cover, as time progresses, we'll cover more about him. So in the interest of time, just moving to the next slide. All right. The antagonist too. This is Jacob Heinrich Schiff. So this gentleman was a Jewish banker. So his family belonged to Frankfurt in a region called Judengasse. So where they were actually exploited, where they were not allowed to get out of that particular region. It was basically a ghetto. They were not given sufficient rights. So most of the Jewish banking families in the United States, very prominent ones like the Warburgs, like the Schiffs, and so on, they all have their origins in Germany. So especially to Frankfurt. So this person is a descendant of that particular lineage. And then he joined a merchant banking establishment called Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which was one of the most powerful and richest investment banks, merchant banks in the United States. It vied with JP Morgan. So for a lot of deals. So he was the one who funded Harriman in this Northern Pacific corner. And prior to that, he also helped Harriman in the expansion of the Union Pacific. Of course, to make a railroad efficient, and you won't believe the operating ratio on those days itself was 40 to 50%. I don't know what the operating ratio of the Indian Railways multiple zones are, but I'm pretty sure it might be a little over that. But in those days, with the ruthless focus on efficiency, they tried to ensure that it was 40 to 50%. They invested in heavy equipment. For that, you needed the dollars. And this was the guy who gave him the dollars. So moving on to the next slide. The next gentleman is James Jewett Stillman. He was a junior antagonist to the list of antagonists, which I have mentioned here. So this gentleman was the co-founder of the National City Bank, which today we are calling it as the City Group. So he was also instrumental in providing a lot of money to Harriman to orchestrate this particular scheme. And last but not the least, this person is William Avery Rockefeller. He was the brother of John D. Rockefeller, who we all know is the founder of Standard Oil Company, one of the largest, most powerful and biggest monopoly in the world in terms of refining of oil. So this gentleman also had interests in copper companies, which were actually upstream and downstream companies for the railroads. His railroad, he also owned a railroad, which was called the Milwaukee Road, which was very inefficiently run, which was not as good as either the Hill lines, which we are going to see, or that of Harriman's railroad. It was very inefficient. But to ensure that he was not threatened, he also joined this particular syndicate against our Pandavas, so which we are going to see in some time. And by the way, an interesting trivia is John D. Rockefeller met Swami Vivekananda when he was in Chicago, and they were discussing about how to lead a very productive life. So we can discuss about it. It's not relevant to this corner, but we'll talk about it later. Okay, so moving on to the protagonists, the good guys. So at least in this episode, this person is called the Empire Builder. Of course, there is an Amtrak train by that name which still goes. This is named in his honor. His name is James Jerome Hill. So he was the creator of the Great Northern Railway Company of the US. And he believed in using his own funds, creating markets, and his railroads were also very much well run and very excellently run. And he was the one who would see, we would see in a while why this corner was initiated, what was the motive behind this. but this gentleman is called the Empire Builder. And then he did a lot of things in terms of improving the operations of the road, which we will see as the time progresses. So he was on the other side. He was the nemesis of Harriman. Right, of course, the most famous of all financiers, John Pierpont Morgan. So he founded his own firm, which was basically what he inherited from his father, Junius Morgan. So which is currently called as JP Morgan Chase. So headed by Jamie Dimon, so which is a direct descendant of the JP Morgan and Company. So he was the most powerful financier of his era. And he was the one who instituted strategic combinations called community of interest to improve efficiency of multiple industries in the United States. So the US was not always about cutthroat competition. They also tried strategic combinations to ensure that heavy industries were efficiently run. So just like how Jacob Schiff provided funding to Edward Harriman, JP Morgan was the dollars, the money man behind James Jerome Hill. Yeah, and last but not the least, this is George Baker. He was the founder of the First National Bank. Just like you had Stillman was a junior partner to Schiff, Baker was like a junior partner to JP Morgan here. First National Bank, incidentally, is still a part of the Citigroup of today. And interestingly, this person was very reticent. He was a man of few words, but he was a very conservative and astute financier. He was the one who gave his name to the Harvard University's library. It's still called the Baker Library. So that's it about George Baker. So this is where the battle lines are drawn. So you have Hill, Morgan, and Baker on one side, and then you have Harriman, Schiff, and his team on the other. So basically, Hill was the founder of the Great Northern Railroad, which was, as I said, very well run, had good traffic. And then he also controlled the Northern Pacific Railroad, which is the theme of our conversation today. And then he tried to acquire another road called the Burlington Road. Of course, we'll cover this in detail in the subsequent slides, just giving you a context. So this is where the battle lines were drawn. So these guys were fighting for commercial interests. Right. So moving on to the companies. So I did give a little bit of an introduction as to the companies. So the team Hill consists of the following companies, which you can see on your screen. And then you had team Harriman, which consisted of his set of companies. So why was there a requirement to fight? Because any industry is always subject to consolidation. As it expands, you will have economies of scale, you want more markets, so on and so forth. Now here is where we need to know a little bit about the geography of the states and why they were fighting, why they did this corner, and why they were fighting for the Burlington route. So though it is called the Northern Pacific Corner and it was initiated as a raid on the shares of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, the fight was not about Northern Pacific at all. The fight was actually about the Burlington route, which you are going to see why. So the team Hill consists of the Great Northern Railroad and then the Northern Pacific. He controlled the Northern Pacific because Great Northern and the Northern Pacific Railway Company were parallel lines. As you know, just like how the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National are parallel in the Canada, but the way they were formed was because of different reasons. Great Northern and Northern Pacific, again, are parallel roads. Parallel roads lead to inefficiency because you will have duplication of track, duplication of markets, duplication of customers, so on and so forth. So why was it parallel? Northern Pacific was a charter. It was initially started by J. Cook and later on, which was run by Henry Villard. It was very inefficiently run. Though it was a parallel line, it didn't exactly cover the major cities en route. And then to remove this inefficiency, Hill came from Canada. He was a Canadian immigrant. He started his own short line. And then he created the Great Northern Railroad on his own funding. And then he ensured that he covered the major cities along the route where he can not only get input markets for his line, such as timber and logging and grain and so on and so forth, but he also ensured that there would be a captive output market for his goods in terms of settling people, creating industries, which we are going to see in a while. So that's how Great Northern was run. And he ensured that the alignment and the grades of the Great Northern Railroad were far, far superior to that of the Northern Pacific. It was the shortest route, it was the straightest route, and then it was, and it had the least cost. Of course, this covered the Pacific Northwest region of the US. So you can start from Minneapolis, St. Paul, which we're going to see the map in a short while. It covered Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then it went up to Seattle, and then it didn't cover any other region of the United States. At that point in time, if you had to reach the eastern side of the US or any other places where you had industry, you should cross Chicago. You should have a link to Chicago. Chicago was and still is the major railroad hub in the US. And then you also needed the lines to the Midwest. He didn't have it. So that connection was given by Burlington. On the other hand, Harriman was also vying for the same Burlington because he also wanted it, because this was more in the southwest corner of the US, and to some extent the middle part of the US. He also didn't have access to Chicago and to the eastern belt. So that was the reason he also desired the Burlington. And of course, he felt threatened. If Hill acquired Burlington, he could actually be hemmed in by Hill by blocking his access to the eastern side of the US. And of course, Hill used to rely on Union Pacific and its allies for transport of goods. But what happened was, if Hill could acquire the Burlington, then the need to actually enter into agreements with Harriman's roads and pay a hefty fee for carriage of Great Northern traffic across the Harriman lines to the east would become redundant if Hill actually took over control of the Burlington. So that was the reason why both of them were vying for the same price, which was Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. So you can see the companies here. The funders for Hill were JP Morgan and First National Bank. Likewise, you can see Harriman, who was born out of poverty, was a son of a pastor. He started his career as a stock running boy, where at that time they used to take over slips from the brokers and transport information from one broker to the other for purchase of stock. So he observed the stock market. Using his financial knowledge, he took over control of the Illinois Central, and then see how meteoric his rise was in the 19th century United States. So he took over Illinois Central. Then he took over Union Pacific. He became the chairman of Union Pacific with the help of Schiff. And then he took over the Southern Pacific. At that time, Southern Pacific was, I think, around 8,000 route miles. Union Pacific was around 5,000, but it reduced to 3,000 because of bankruptcy. So together, he owned more lines than Hill himself. Hill was also an immigrant. He was also born out of poverty, but Harriman's rise was even more meteoric. And then, of course, Harriman's funders were Kun Loeb and Company, whom we saw, which was Jacob Schiff. And then, of course, First City Bank, James Stillman. Yeah. We will also cover a little bit about the lines themselves, the Harriman lines. So you can see here that the major Harriman, of course, controlled some more railroads as well, but the major railroads he controlled was the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and the Illinois Central. And you can see that he started his career from Illinois. Union Pacific, this Union Pacific shield has remained practically unchanged for the hundreds of years of their company's existence, which is still impressive. They still use a variant of the shield. This is called the bend, the sinister bend. And their famous tagline is the overland route. And then Southern Pacific is currently a part of the Union Pacific. The UP took over SP sometime in the late 90s. I think it was around 1996. But that was basically, that's what we are going to see. It's all history is going to repeat. And then we are going to see deja vu. Whatever these guys wanted to do and achieve, whatever was stopped by government interference was achieved later on in the 90s. So anyway, so Southern Pacific, which was at that time far more larger and far more important because it was in the far south with favorable climate. And then you had more markets, so on and so forth. That's why he also acquired Southern Pacific. And then we're going to see the maps of these railroads that will give a little bit more context. So this is the Illinois Central. So you can see here that, as I said, it's a north-south transcontinental. You can see that it runs from the north, from Wisconsin over here. You have some extension here, and then it runs south through Louisiana. So it's it was at one point in time the longest transcontinental in the US, and then it was very, very important for trade and commerce in the US. The railroads were built more for strategic commercial purposes, for transport of inputs and also for outputs. The freight always came first, then the passenger interest came even at that point in time. So this is the line around the time of the corner, circa 1892. And then, of course, this is the Union Pacific. So you can see how it covers the Midwest and the central part of the US. And Union Pacific, incidentally, though, I mean, these industrialists were given power to run and control thousands and thousands of miles of railroad lines at that point in time. But some of the railroads there were state chartered, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Union Pacific, like that. You do have some examples which were later on given over to private hands to run such a vast network. And then this is the Southern Pacific. So you can see here that it covers the southern and southwestern part of the United States, the current side, California, Arizona, New Mexico, so on and so forth. Right. So moving on, the hill lines, the major hill lines were, of course, the Great Northern Railway and the Northern Pacific. So I already gave a little bit of a context as to the hill lines. This was probably one of the very few roads which was conceived and built fully funded. And it was the exact opposite of the Northern Pacific. Northern Pacific was always under scandals before Hill took over, and then he did a sort of a combination with his lines to make it more efficient. So it was a federally land chartered road. So it was run by J. Cook initially and later by Henry Willard. So both of them had their own share of financial crisis before Hill took over and put it along with Morgan as a community of interest, as they called it. And then they tried to make it efficient. So I'll show you the map. Yeah, this is the Great Northern. You can see this covers the Pacific Northwest. So you can see it starts from Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is where Hill settled down, and then it goes up to Seattle. And then Hill always had a lot of link with Canada because he was a Canadian immigrant himself who settled down in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And then he had links with the Canadian Pacific, the founders of the Canadian Pacific, which we'll cover later if we have the time. And you can see here that this line and then the Northern Pacific, which you're going to see, parallels this. There was absolutely no connection to the southern part of the United States, either to Chicago or to the other parts which we saw on the Illinois Central lines or in any of the other markets which are covered by the UP. So that's why he badly wanted the Burlington route, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. So this is the Northern Pacific. So you can see that this was interestingly called as running from nowhere to nowhere. So that is what this railroad was actually called. So this is the map, and moving on. So we cover the companies. Now we are going to cover their target. What was their object? The object was this road, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. So this road, it was conservatively run. It was tightly held by a close-knit group of Boston financiers. So they operated it on very, very conservative lines. It had the least amount of debt. And then its stock price is undervalued in current parlance. And of course, we are going to see the continuation in terms of Warren Buffett and how Warren Buffett is relevant for this today. But this had low levels of debt and it was underpriced in the market. So this was a typical, the diamond among the value stocks. And then they had some problems as well. Though it was a jackpot, you had populous towns and significant industries and market for the railroad to cover and transport. It was sort of hemmed in between Harriman's empire and Hill's empire. They couldn't expand. They didn't have the mouth to take on large amounts of debt to expand. So that's why they wanted to sell their road off. And it was managed by Charles Elliott Perkins, who was also an excellent railroad manager. And this is the map of the Burlington. So you can see here, this covers Warren Buffett's current territory in Nebraska. So anyway, so that's a different thing. But you can see how very dense this network is compared to the others. And then how it covers some of the very major towns. at that point in time. And then how it will give them access to Chicago, which is here. And then eventually using the roads like the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, more connections to the east. So that's why they had their eyes on this. Anyway. Yeah. So we'll also cover a little bit about the Hill roads combined. I was talking about community of interests of JP Morgan, how JP Morgan helped Hill to create an unofficial combine of the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern. This is relevant for us because Great Northern was tightly held, like the Burlington, both the common stock and the preferred stock. So common stock gives a share of ownership of the company. Preferred stock is more like debt, though it is a share, it gives fixed dividends. Both of them were tightly held, so it was difficult to acquire. So in this unofficial combine, you also had the Northern Pacific common and preferred. Because Jay Cook and Henry Willard had actually sold to multiple retail and institutional investors in Europe, in Germany and in the Netherlands, and also some of the retail institutional investors in the States, it was more dispersed and widely held. It was easier for any raider to acquire the stocks of the Northern Pacific. So this is the statement here. Whoever controls the Northern Pacific would effectively gain control of the Burlington also, along with the Northern Pacific. So he would not only own the Burlington, but he would also control the Northern Pacific. So that was the reason if any competitor wanted a raid, they would raid the shares of Northern Pacific. Anyway, I'll tell you what happened now. So Charles Perkins was a huge fan of Hill and the way he had ran his railroads and also his alliance with Morgan, because they all knew that Morgan was the one who created US Steel by acquiring the steel works from Andrew Carnegie. And then he had created some industrial empires. He was a proponent of efficiency, and he was also conservative. And Hill had connections with Canada, which was also being virtue of being a British dominion. People like George Stephens, who created the Canadian Pacific Railroad, Cornelius Van Horn, who also helped in the surveying and creation of the Canadian Pacific. So he knew Hill, he knew how he ran his roads, which we're going to cover in a short while. So he wanted to sell his road to Great Northern and James Hill. Harriman got wind of it and approached Perkins and tried to outbid him. He tried to give a very different offer. He tried to sweeten the deal, but Perkins did not budge. So what he did, he consummated a deal with Hill. So what Hill did was he acquired around 96.79% of the Burlington for $215 million at that time. And then it was actually, a couple of months before this deal, Burlington was selling at what, $150, $130 a share. And he paid $200 a share, which was a hefty premium because he knew the potential of the Burlington. And then what Hill decided to do was he wanted to give the bonds of both Great Northern and Northern Pacific in exchange for shares to the shareholders of the Burlington, in exchange of shares of the Burlington. That's what he wanted to do. So effectively, through this transaction, 49.3% of the Burlington would be owned by Northern Pacific. That was the weakest link in the chain, which Harriman decided to exploit, which we will see now. I hope I was not fast. Hope it was fine, Mr. Singh. I wanted to cover as much as possible. So
this is nice. Good. Yeah.
Thanks. Right.
You're doing fine. Please continue.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Singh. Anyway, so moving on to the actual crux of this topic. Now, they decided to institute a raid on the Northern Pacific. So you can see now a gentleman actually, of course, at that point in time, you didn't have charts and graphs and Excel and all that stuff, but it was done by a Finion, an individual who was interested in financial history of the state. So he created this particular chart showing the price of Northern Pacific. I think this is preferred stock because we are going to come to that in some time. So they tried to raid both common and preferred, but they focused more on the preferred stock as opposed to the common stock. Why? They thought that preferred stocks were easier to acquire. They had voting rights for the board of directors of Northern Pacific. So Harriman and Schiff thought that if they could acquire a majority of the preferred stock, and of course some of the common stock, and so that they have majority using a combination of preferred and common, but preferred being weighted more, they could elect the board of directors of Northern Pacific with their proxies. That's what they taught. And then you can see here that around the time of the corner, which is around May 1901, look at the spike in the share price. So you can see that it was basically worthless. Northern Pacific, everybody knew that it was overshadowed by Hill's Great Northern. It was only used as a subsidiary line to Hill's Great Northern, maybe to run some empty rakes or something like that. Or if at all there was any block in Great Northern, it could be used as a sort of a secondary line for that, or any one or two specific markets. That was what was used by Northern Pacific. Otherwise, it was basically worthless. So it was only few pennies and few dollars and pennies on the share. That was what it was. And look, it goes up to 240. On the day of the corner, it went up to USD 1,000 a share. So that was the impact of the corner. How they instituted the corner, we'll see that. This is still applicable for the current day. So it's just buy, baby, full, complete buy. But how they instituted that buy is still adopted by many players today, though in a very different way. They secretly purchased smaller and smaller lots. They didn't go for one big block of shares. They broke their purchase into smaller and smaller lots. And then from all investors. And then they didn't route their trades through a single broker. Otherwise, word would leak out in the market that these guys are trying to buy and corner the shares. So they split their orders among multiple brokers. So nobody knew which broker was acting on the orders of whom. Third thing, they also simultaneously tried to buy from the Europeans, from both the Germans and the Dutch. And then they also try to hide their trades by spacing larger buys, but they also sold the stocks. I mean, some of them would be considered illegal or dubious now, but what they did is something like spoofing is what they are calling. That's illegal in the current day. But at that time, what they did was they bought, say, 100 shares, and then they sold 80. They bought 100 again, they sold 80. So net, they were always net long, and they tried to buy net 20 shares, something like that. They tried to institute it over, say, they started the scheme off sometime in March, April, and then they instituted it till May. So they had a well-planned and coordinated effort for around 2 to 3 months to buy the shares, and nobody was aware of it. And then they also did this. They also inserted this information within the news media. If at all somebody raised questions about why the Northern Pacific share price was increasing, they tried to give this information. It was increasing because of some very false reason. They used to say maybe Hill would sell this line off to Harriman, or Harriman is not interested. Anything other than the truth, they gave the information in the news media. That's what they were trying to do. Moving on. Then at some point in time, these guys should become aware of it, right? So the Wall Street Journal was still around then. Wall Street Journal is one of the premier financial newspapers in the States, started by Charles Dow. And one of the journalists of the Wall Street Journal was very astute, and he could somehow figure out that the purchase in Northern Pacific was orchestrated by Harriman's team. So there was that article, which was the first warning for Hill. And then what happened? These fellows, they overplayed their hand. When they thought that they had control, they confronted James Hill. So they went to him. Jacob Schiff and Edward Harriman directly went to Hill's offices, and then they said, "We are almost in control. Would you like to give up? We can take it." It was just like a give and take. They said, "We will take you on our combine as a manager of our combine, but we have control now." Hill was horrified, and then he immediately contacted JP Morgan's agents. He had his own list of white shoe bankers in New York, so he contacted him. He contacted Baker, and then they hurriedly opened the books where they maintained the record of stock ownership, and they tried reconciling and seeing how much they are still owning and how much was with this group. And then they telegrammed this information to JP Morgan, who was actually on vacation on the other side of the Atlantic in France, at a place called Aix-les-Bains in France. He was a huge fan of UK and France. He often used to go for vacation there. So he was actually vacationing in France when he also got to know of this shock. And then after this, You also can see that at that time itself, they started using this transatlantic sea cable. So it was at that point in time, the world was slowly getting more globalized and industrialized, so as to speak. It was the first wave of industrialization. Morgan telegrammed back to his agents in New York, stating that buy at any cost. That was the telegram he gave. He said, these fellows are trying to take over control. If Harriman takes over control of Northern Pacific, Hill's entire life and effort would be lost. Why? Because Northern Pacific, which Hill was effectively running, would go, Burlington would go, and he would be left only with the Great Northern. So, and it would be completely isolated or a secondary or a smaller line. So they had to get over this. This was on a Friday. On a Saturday, they initiated frantic buying of shares, buy at any cost. And that was when the stock price increased to $1,000. Anyway, that was the return salvo. This was what, interestingly, this is what happened in the stock market. This also happened in January 2021. I'm going to come to that in some time. But people, you all know that I told you that Northern Pacific was worth pennies and dollars on a share. So people are actually shorting the shares of Northern Pacific. Shorting matlab, they sold the shares of Northern Pacific without having ownership of it on the intent that the stock price will fall. So if you look at it, even in India, a couple of years ago, the RBI and SEBI, they tried to ban short selling because of this very reason, because it's naked speculation. So they thought that now that Northern Pacific is rising, it doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's just like Bitcoin. Bitcoin, they say, doesn't have intrinsic value, right? It doesn't have intrinsic value because the road doesn't have sufficient traffic. It is a shadow of the Great Northern. So why should the stock price rise? So people, even common Americans, not just in big institutions, they started shorting the shares of Northern Pacific. But when Harriman was instituting his corner, and then from the other side of the Atlantic, JP Morgan was ordering him to buy at any cost, the stock price increased. So when it increased up to 1,000, there is a concept called margin in stock trading. So whenever these traders are suffering a loss, when they are expecting a decline, but when the stock price increases, they had to pay margin or close out their positions at a huge loss. So many retail investors became bankrupt. That is essentially what happened as a result of the corner. It caused a huge public outcry, a huge uproar in the States. Anyway, who won? So that last minute purchase by JP Morgan ensured that he had a razor thin majority of the common stock, and then he got his lawyers. This is where the lawyers are also important. They went over the articles of association, and they said that preference shares alone won't do. Common stock has more power and control. The common stockholders have the power not to hold the board meeting, which Harriman was dependent on. And then they could, by not holding the board meeting, they could veto the rights of Harriman to elect the board. So it was Hill who won, but by a very less margin. But as I mentioned it here, it was a Pyrrhic victory. We'll see why it was a Pyrrhic victory. So you can see that this was another cartoon from the newspaper of that era. So it was a cyclone. And then it was a Pyrrhic victory because it was accomplished at a great cost to the retail stockbrokers. Many of them were on the verge of bankruptcy. Retail investors lost a lot. So what happened after that? So they agreed to peace terms. They knew that if they allowed this to continue, the uproar would become worse. And even the brokers and financial institutions would go bankrupt, too big to fail. What we saw in the financial crisis, that would again happen. So they decided to bury the hatchet, and then they decided to settle all the shots at $150. They had a shot, so they had to book it at a great loss and exit. And then they formed this structure called the Northern Securities Trust. So what was unofficial between Northern and Great Northern and Northern Pacific became official. So both the securities of Great Northern and Northern Pacific were kept into a separate voting trust called Northern Securities. And then Harriman, for all his efforts to not trivialize him or to make him even more hostile, they agreed to a concession. The Great Northern, it was not Northern Securities, but Great Northern, which will own the Burlington, and Union Pacific would have an interest. It was called an interest. It could block expansion of the Burlington, but it didn't have any other say in any management or any other stuff. It could only block expansion because Harriman's worry was if Burlington expanded, Union Pacific would be threatened. So that was why they agreed to this concession. So this Northern Securities Trust was formed, and this caused even more uproar. I'll tell you why. So we are going to discuss a little bit about the consequences of this. People there, as of now, why we are discussing about this 120 or so years later? Because any industrialist for that matter, it's very important that they have a proper public opinion. They can't lose in the court of public opinion. And then how much of government oversight is required and how much is more than warranted so that it stifles the innovation or competition, does not allow them to expand, and how much is too less so that you have rapacious industrialists exploiting the people or the country. So what is that balance in government oversight which is required? These are questions which are still important for the current day. And then more from a railroading perspective, what happened was the government decided to take over control of rate setting, the control over rate setting and the rate subsidization, community of interest, cartel, pool, those were all abolished. And then the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was just a non-entity, was given more powers and it put control over the rates. And they slowly started strangling the railroads. And they also started encouraging competition for the railroads by government ironically subsidized the trucking and the highways in the United States. That started with this episode. The slow decline of the railroads, which accelerated after the 1960s in the US, started with this. And then, of course, you have a very famous president called Theodore Roosevelt. He was called T-Rex. I mean, the dinosaur Tyrannosaurus Rex is actually a representation of him. He was also called the teddy bear, the teddy. So that's why I called him Teddy Rex. But he was a proper politician. He was very popular, and he served as the police commissioner of New York first before becoming the president. And then he instituted a lot of reforms domestically. And then he was an able administrator, and he was very much loved by the public in the US. So he used the Sherman antitrust, this is antitrust law, Sherman antitrust law to great effect. And then he broke up Northern Securities. Later on, Standard Oil was also broken up. And then the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific combination was also broken up. But that was over a span of a decade. So he used this. And then with his president of Sherman Antitrust, several other trusts were also broken. So he was called as a trust buster who wanted to have a progressive capitalism, which also benefited the people so that the riches could be shared by the people as well. So this is Theodore Roosevelt. And then this is one cartoon, which is caricaturing him busting the trusts. So that is that. Anyway, interestingly, this is just another trivia. Just like how Swami Vivekananda met John D. Rockefeller, there were other things which also happened around this time. At this point in time, I would also like to give what happened in India. India, as you know, was under British control, British colony then. So there were a lot of freedom fighters, especially the revolutionaries and the Ghadarites, who are actually in the US and in Canada, who were pitching for Indian independence with the multiple US presidents. His predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt's predecessor, William McKinley, was actually in support of Indian independence, but Theodore Roosevelt was not. Just a trivia. So even at that point in time, India had some influence in global affairs. So Indians were doing this. They were global. So just wanted to tell that. Right. Other questions, the unanswered questions. So you can see that how much power can a single person have, right? Even today, Warren Buffett controls around, I think it was 30,500, route miles of track of Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which incidentally is the hill line. I'm going to cover that after this PPT. And then at that point in time, 8,000 Union Pacific and Southern Pacific together was around 8,000 to 10,000 miles. Hills lines was around 10,000 miles. How much can a single person control? And how are monopolies beneficial to the society before it can be broken? How much of government control is necessary? What is and should not be fair competition? Can there be coalition of interests, like combinations, like strategic combinations and cartels, which JP Morgan encouraged? Why is this relevant? these companies, the software companies, are called by a very famous professor in the US as four horsemen of the apocalypse, because Apple, as you know, is worth trillions of dollars, far bigger than the GDP of many countries. So Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, they are extremely powerful, and you know that they are a sort of a monopoly in their respective areas. And then, of course, you have China coming up, and then you have the risks of AI with respect to these companies. And then you have big banks over there. Banks have also consolidated. And then you have JP Morgan, which the current JP Morgan run by Jamie Dimon, which took over some of the failed banking institutions over there, which happened recently, just a couple of months ago. That James Dimon was actually called James Pierpont Dimon, a play on the JP Morgan. So they are quite big, and they are also too big to fail, and then they have outsized power. So how much of regulation should be there over them? What is that balance between innovation, free enterprise, and government control? These are still relevant for the current day. So this, if you look at this this entire exercise of how the industrialists ran the roads, you have a lot of positives. And then on the negative side, if you look at how the governments try to control them and what were the arguments which are put for and against control of these enterprises, you'll see they are still playing out in the current day. Right. Moving on. Yeah. So we are also going to cover a little bit. This is the penultimate theme, so as to say, lessons in management and railroad operations. There was a famous person by the name of Alfred Chandler. He wrote a lot of books on modern management and how industries influence modern management. He is equal to Peter Drucker in terms of management principles. According to all of them, the consensus is the railway influenced or created, I wouldn't even say influenced, the railways created modern management. The hierarchical organization structure, the division of work, delegation, how operating departments should be run, how finance department should be run. So the entire principles of modern management have their origin in the privately run and operated railroads in the States. And then you will also see some of their principles of running a railroad, which are still relevant for the current day. So what did Hill do to run his railroad? So Hill's method, I have just split it between Hill's method and Harriman's method. So for the first 5,000 miles of track, Hill preferred organic growth. Organic growth, matlab, he laid mile after mile of track. He surveyed that region. He ensured that the shortest and the most efficient lines were laid. And he used the services of an engineer called John Frank Stevens. Incidentally, he was the one who discovered the Marias Pass, which is used by the BNSF Railway today. And then the Amtrak's Empire Builder still uses it. So, and John Frank Stevens was so very much respected in the civil engineering space that even the Canadian railroads used him. The Stevens Pass, I think even the Kicking Horse Pass, if I'm not wrong, I'm not completely sure on that, but the Stevens Pass in the US and some of the passes in Canada were also a result of his effort in surveying the railroads in the Pacific Northwest. So he used the talent of the best engineers, not just for surveying the roads, but also for running them. And he was a big proponent of creating markets. So he was the first to think about linking Asia with the United States, which is being done today. As a matter of fact, you have the supply chain in China. It comes to ports in California. The railroads transport all the goods throughout the entire continental section of the United States to eastern US. And likewise, whatever US has to export to China, it goes from the eastern part of the US through the entire geography to the ports, and then it goes to the Asian markets. Hill was the progenitor of that idea. So he was the one who thought we can use railroads not just as a domestic mechanism, but as a means to link countries through shipping. You have the ships, so which will link through the sea. So the ship through the sea lines and the railroad lines are one continuum, one continuous stream of transportation. So he tried to open Japan and China to the northwestern US. So he is still very much recognized for that effort. So what he did, the timber and some manufactured goods from Midwest, they all flowed into Japan. And then the Japanese and Japanese products, the silk from China, it came and then it was transported by Great Northern into the US. And So he also tried to own downstream the steamship companies as well, so that he had one integrated transport empire. So he looked at railroads as one integral part of an entire transportation empire. And then he also created, in addition to linking cities, he also created settlements. These settlements would be huge farms which provided grain and other agricultural produce, poultry, animal husbandry, where they could transport livestock, or just set up other settlements where other industries could be set up. So he created all that. So he created markets, both input and output markets. He created industry. Interestingly, you all are aware of the Pillsbury atta dough, right? The Pillsbury company has its origin in Minneapolis. That's a direct creation of the Great Northern Railroad. So the flour from Pacific, the wheat grains from Pacific Northwest was transported to Minneapolis, where Pillsbury company, with the help of Hill, was set up. And Pillsbury was a big friend of Hill. And then he set up this factory, and then the grain was used. The wheat was changed into grain. The flour was created, and then it was transported all over the world. So he created that Pillsbury flour industry. Just another trivia. Then I told about best possible route, usage of the most modern locomotives with limited turnaround time. So he was of the view that no locomotive should run independent. There should not be any independent running of steam locomotives. You run it with rakes, both up and on the downside, and both the time the rake should be full. So if you're transporting timber to, say, Midwest or to Chicago, on the return journey, you will have some other series of cars transporting, or wagons transporting something else on the opposite end. So neither the rake nor the locomotive should run independent. That was one of his principles, no empty running of rakes. And the last but not the least, which no other industrialist of that era followed, was that good public relations and a media campaign. He was a huge proponent of speaking to the public, speaking to the employees, to ensure that he created goodwill among the employees, all the railroad employees. There are thousands and thousands of people who worked under him. He used to speak to every one of them. He held town halls. He visited across the network hands-on. He was hands-on manager across the network, though he was the head. He spoke to them. He created a feeling of goodwill. He spoke to politicians. He spoke to the people who settled down in his settlements. He spoke to the people of the different cities to ensure that his road, as opposed to Union Pacific and other railroads, which always had a negative public image that they are robber barons, Great Northern had a positive image because he was able to communicate and articulate to them the economic impact of Great Northern in terms of the jobs, in terms of building industries, in jobs of connecting Asia with the US, and so on and so forth. So he was a pioneer. And nowadays we have a good media campaign across all companies, but Hill was a pioneer in that. So these are the Hill's approach. And of course you have more, but in the interest of time, I'm just moving on to Harriman's approach. Harriman, there is one word for him, the Occam's razor, laser focus over the operating cost. His roads had an operating ratio of 45% in that age, 45 to 49%. Can you imagine in that day where you had so much of labor intensive work? I mean, that was one thing. Ruthless control over the operating cost. His principles were still being followed by Hunter Harrison, the late Hunter Harrison. He tried following it under a scheme called precision scheduled railroading, but more on that for a different day. Harriman was a proponent of increased axle loading for on the tracks. So he always laid 90-pound, 80, 90, 100-pound rails as opposed to 50, 60-pound rail, which was be the norm then. So he ensured that when you lay heavy pounded rails on the track, you could carry more with the same number of cars. Cars, matlab, I am using the American terminology here, wagons. The same number of wagons, you can carry more. And then if you increase the axle loading, you can also have bigger and larger locomotives rather than having double heading or triple heading. So he was a big proponent of that. He also ensured that the sleepers are tightly spaced so that the axle loading, again, it complemented the heavy pounded rails. And then till the late 1980s, Union Pacific had this regular track gang maintenance, whereas all other railroads became more mechanized in the US. So that was instituted by Harriman. They always were very proud of the track gang maintenance. And then, of course, he also allowed financial engineering. So he used the lower cost debt of the Illinois Central to fund the Union Pacific expansion. If the Union Pacific went out to the market, it could get loan at 8% interest rate. The Illinois Central could get loan at 4% interest rate. So he used the funds from Illinois Central to fund the Union Pacific. That is one thing he did. Then He also tried to have captive banks, which of course even Tata had. Tata Industrial Bank became the central bank in Mumbai that used to fund or help the Tata's industrial enterprises. So like that, he had his own bank. It was called the Harriman Bank. It merged with the Brown Brothers, which was another very famous name, and it still currently exists. It's called Brown Brothers Harriman. So that was controlling banks to fund rail lines, retiring more expensive debt and replacing it with cheaper debt. So these are the kinds of, and he was also, unlike Hill, was hands-on. Harriman, though, had a reputation for being a taskmaster, he could also delegate work to people whom he liked best. For instance, Illinois Central was delegated to a guy called Stuyvesant Fish because he gained his trust. If somebody gained his trust and rapport, he could delegate it to him and he would give him complete authority to run it on his terms. And he was a big proponent of inorganic. When Hill was organic growth, this guy was inorganic growth, acquisition. Organic growth is growing from within. You expand on your own, build rails the hard way up. Whereas inorganic growth is you buy other rail lines. He was a big fan of that. And there is an interesting story when I'll tell you why he acquired Union Pacific. Right? He had, number one, he had big ambitions, but as I said, Union Pacific had gone bankrupt multiple times because all these federally chartered roads, they were beset by inefficiencies and corruption because of political interference. So when the first time it became bankrupt, I think it was Jay Gould, whom I mentioned in the gold corner. He took over the UP, he made it efficient, and then he was pushed out. And then he ran another railroad called the Missouri Pacific. Later on, these two roads were merged. Currently, Union Pacific and Missouri Pacific were merged into one line later on, but that's the story for a different day. But Harriman, he saw that the second time Union Pacific became bankrupt, they were trying to reorganize it, but they were not able to. And then when Schiff finally tried to reorganize the road, Harriman put some hostile acts in between, like influencing senators, having a wrong public opinion, stopping legislations or something like that. He was trying all this effort at stopping or stalling the legislations. So Schiff found out, and then these men met, and then he told him about how he had turned around the Illinois Central, and he said he will do the same thing for the Union Pacific. Schiff was not impressed initially, but after he gave him a try, Harriman turned Union Pacific around. Union Pacific, from being a loss-making dusty specks of rail, as it was called by JP Morgan, it became one of the most profitable enterprises even in his own day. By 1901, at the time of the corner, it was minting money. Its traffic had tripled. Its operating ratio was 45%. And then the president of the US, I think it was William McKinley, who actually ran on that road, and then he could not believe it, the way he had turned around the Union Pacific Railroad. So that's what that was Harriman's magic. Anyway, moving on. So I just have one final slide. What happened in 2021, 120 years later? So there was a company called GameStop Corporation. I hope the slide is visible. I just lost it in between. So this is the share price of GameStop Corporation. See the similarity? The stock price just went through the roof. This was also a corner to beat the shots. But one change here was this was a corner by the common people. Usually the common people are at the receiving end, but here, through an app called Robinhood, which was founded by a man of Indian origin, Baiju Bhatt, I think his name is, along with a Bulgarian. So they used that Robinhood app, they democratized trading. And then, it also led to gamification of trading, but they bought shares and shares. This was a failing company, which was actually short sold by many institutional short sellers like hedge funds. But these people all connected in a forum called Reddit, which is again illegal to discuss all these things as per standards of practice, but they connected on Reddit. They tried to boost the share price up so that the institutional investors suffered. So all the common people bandied together and they pushed the stock price up. So which is somewhat similar to the Northern Pacific corner. So I would just like to end this by stating that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So this was a saying by George Santayana. So with that, I would like to close this presentation. So thank you very much. So I would like to uh, stop share and open the floor for further discussions on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manikandan. Any comments, questions and answers?
Mani, Apurva here. This is absolutely an unrecognized part of railways. I never thought of railways in this way.
Okay.
And it's completely, an aspect of operations. And actually, it is more about banking and finance than railway operations. Now,
Yep.
there was one question about operating ratio of Indian Railways. Did you say 50%?
No, I don't know what the current operating ratio
I
is,
think it
but
will be in the negative. It cannot be.
yep. I mean,
The current operating ratio is very close to 100.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Abuji.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Manikandan. That was a lovely presentation. Kept us riveted. I think in your next presentation, you should tell us who are the robber barons. We keep hearing about robber barons.
Mhm.
And what led to the demise of the passenger traffic.
Okay.
Maybe another time. And of course, somebody is supposed to have said, the public be damned or the customer be damned or something.
Yep.
Some saying was it. So anyway, it was most absorbing. I was a little reluctant to, but then you really kept me glued to the screen, so to speak. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your kind words.
Anyway, thank you. Only one point. How did this lead to the Sherman-Taft Act ultimately?
Oh, yes, sir. The Sherman Antitrust Act was already in existence for some time before this particular corner happened. Just that since the US always had a series of lobbies, the industrialists had actually lobbied the Republican government not to go ahead or press on with any strong or punitive implementation of the antitrust law. So they could always go ahead with these combinations. But what happened in this particular instance was the public outcry was so great because so many people lost their jobs, so many people became bankrupt. The financial institutions were on the verge of bankruptcy, including a lot of brokers. It caused a lot of pain on the other side of the Atlantic as well. And then they could see with their own eyes how it was just two people. One was Harriman with a set of bankers like Schiff. The other was JP Morgan and Hill. Outsized power. I mean, an influence they had. I mean, they could buy almost the entire stock. I mean, 90% of Northern Pacific. Basically, before this corner, you had only around 60 to 70% of Northern Pacific, which was outside, was publicly held, publicly dispersed, and only 30% was with big institutions. These people with their money, they could buy almost 90% of Northern Pacific at the expense of everybody else. And this was a private war. This guy, Harriman, was wanting to expand his empire. Hill was trying to protect it for their own personal corporate interests. They could the entire country was actually led to the dogs because of their own private interests. So the public outcry was great. So a lot of lawsuits were filed to implement this Antitrust Act. And then Theodore Roosevelt went ahead, and then there was this famous case called the Northern Securities Company versus United States, which was one of the very first implementation of the Sherman antitrust law. And then he decided to, and that had a lot of judgments also. You had Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s father was a big fan of India. So he used to love the Indian cultural heritage in his poems. So he was the one who coined the terms Boston Brahmins. I mean, that was basically to represent the intellectual and the intelligentsia and the elites of that society. He termed them that way, but he liked the Indian culture and heritage. His son, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., famously stated that good cases make bad laws. I will give a dissenting opinion, but they have already lost in the court of public opinion. So we are just going ahead and breaking this trust. So that was how they implemented the Sherman antitrust law.
Thank you for that. That
I'm surprised you know this by heart and everything, all this history is on your fingertips. It's like amazing that you studied so much about the subject.
Thank you.
Yeah. Warren sir, you wanted to speak. You had some comments. Mr. Warren?
No,
Yeah, you had some
you-
comments. Yeah.
well, apart from that, it was a really excellent presentation, but no, nothing to add.
All right.
Thanks, Mr.
And
Malik.
the gentleman whose name is Uma, he had raised his hand. So you wanted to speak, Uma?
Right, Mani, let me compliment you on a most wonderful talk. It's been a very great learning experience. I think a lot of similarities with India, not some similarities, particularly on the management side. I think the principles of good management, which you see on both sides, protagonists and antagonists, are principles that are still followed to this day on any railroad, and we have tried to adopt them on Indian Railways since the very beginning.
Yep.
As far as investment in the railways is concerned, in India, there was an added feature that when they set up the railways in India, the government gave a guaranteed return on investment. And that's how you got these so many shareholders in the United Kingdom.
Yep.
There were hardly any Indian shareholders. They were all Britishers sitting in London who invested in the railways, and the government from the very beginning ensured at least a 4.5% rate of return. So that is why the railways in India, they say, were gold-plated, and the cost of construction of railways in India was much higher than perhaps elsewhere in the world. Coming to operating ratio, I mean, I've been looking at operating ratios in the pre-independence days, and the operating ratio in India was also 40%.
Okay.
It ranged between 40 to 60%. 60% was sort of poorly managed railways. So at around independence, it was 60% the operating ratio. Unfortunately, now, because we have expanded manpower costs are going up, and so on and so forth. We have over the last perhaps decade or two, we are hovering between 95 and 102 or something like that.
Okay.
But again, compliments for a very wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. And the
thank you, sir.
cutthroat competition that existed in the United States.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
I would like to add to what Viru said. I must say your knowledge of railroads in America, history of these railroads, their finance, and the personalities involved is phenomenal.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, it's difficult to have all these aspects in one place in one person.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. It was a very, very enlightening talk, completely different from any talk that we have had till now. And as I forget who mentioned it, but we would like to have another talk by you, where you talk of what happened to the passenger traffic in the USA.
Sure, sir. Definitely. I mean, that's something which I always like to read about, and I'm researching on. That's something that's very close to my heart. So definitely, I will. I mean, if at an appropriate occasion, I'll present about the robber barons and the decline of the passenger traffic in the.
So after a few months, when you are ready, we can have another talk by you.
Okay. So there is another thing which has happened here. So these guys, they wanted to combine, right? You had the three roads: Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Those are the original lines which wanted to combine, which was, of course, broken up by Theodore Roosevelt. In the 1970s, Great Northern and Northern Pacific combined to form Burlington Northern. So that was the first instance of Hill's vision being put into effect. And then later on, in the 1970s, Northern Pacific, Great Northern, and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, all the three combined in 1970. And that was the first instance of that being put into effect. And then in the 1980s, they passed the Staggers Act, where they removed all these restrictions and rate control and oversight of ICC over rates. And then the railways are allowed to expand and then be more independent. So that actually led to a revival of railroads since around the late 1970s, early 1980s onwards in the freight department. So the railroads became profitable and they started carrying more and more freight. And then BN became BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, because the Santa Fe Railroad was acquired in 1996 by BN. And then Warren Buffett took over control. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway took over control of all these 4 lines, and BNSF is with him. So he is the current day James Jerome Hill, if I may call it.
So if there are no more questions or comments, we can close for the day with a large wholehearted thanks to Mr. Manikandan Venketaramanan for an excellent talk. And we look forward to your next talk, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for all of your time.
Thanks to all the audience who listened very patiently. And as Mr. V. Anand said, remain glued to the screen.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Manny, on an outstanding presentation.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much, and thanks for attending.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I had no doubt that you would do a wonderful job on this. I must say that you have such a vast knowledge of U.S. railroading and the history, and your presentation, you did a great job of consolidating all the people and the events in such a concise story. And I look forward to more as well. And perhaps you can talk about the greatest bankruptcy in U.S. history at the time, which was the Penn Central Railroad. I know you would love to talk about that at some time in the future, because there are some fantastic players and events that took place in the 1960s and 70s.
Sure, Bob. Definitely. Thank you so much for suggesting. We'll give it a try. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. And we can close for the day. Thanks a lot.
Sir, share the recording with me.
Okay, I'll do
close
that.
the recording. Yes. Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.